All right.
Yeah, or as my cousin says, we don't be standing on no damn ceremony over here, young. Come on over here, get in this house, get in this damn kitchen, young. Shoot, don't be asking me for shit. You know where it is.
Hey y'all, 10 people here. What's up? What's up? What's up? Happy New Year's Eve.
I was gonna say New Year's Eve.
Wait.
New Year's Eve. What's up, y'all?
Woo.
The building. Hopefully some of you all got a chance to catch the noon show today on national politics.
Yep, and this is going to be our last show of the day. There might be, something happening later on in the week, but this was our, I guess, half-day extravaganza then of our 2024 recap. We're focusing on international politics. We got some great things to discuss, some heavy things, some exciting things. So we're so happy to be in conversation and community with the People's Prophetess.
Yes.
Yeah. So
I'm still very weirded out with that name.
It's been years now. I'm sticking with it.
I see that you have not abandoned it.
Nobody said African Queens forever.
Nobody
never. Oh my God.
One of our show watchers has taken to trolling me with Dr. Umar Johnson content and sends me, like, probably every couple weeks or so, just sends me another outrageous video of Umar Johnson. And I'm just like, why are you doing this to me all the time?
The Pan-African friend?
And it's always something super ridiculous too, because like I'm not a Umar follower, but every once in a while he says things that I can. But the person who sends me these things always sends me the absolute most ridiculous.
That's. I was wondering if that was like Dr. Umar in disguise.
Well,
on the one hand, it's like, "Ooh, Dr. Umar found us," but on the other hand, it's like, "Please stop." Stop.
Oh my God. I think the chat would be a light. So yeah, y'all. So basically the format of the show, we have our sort of top 10, not even top 10, just 10 things that spoke to us that we want to cover from the year. And then we'll start with an honorable mention. And always, of course, with the upshot of a critique of US imperialism and like, what does this mean for African people? Even if it's not happening in the African diaspora, the Black diaspora on the continent, it matters to Black people. Everything matters to Black people, matters to African people. So that is always going to be the lens through which we understand all international politics. Yep. So we got a lot to cover, y'all. Should we get started?
I think we can go ahead.
Where shall we get started? Are we starting with the honorable mention?
Starting with the honorable mention.
Woo. What an honorable mention this is, though, because it's not like a small thing. It was so weird when this happened, because I don't know about y'all, but I heard about the martial law being imposed in South Korea kind of in passing when I was in the car on the way to something. And then I'm like, woo, what is happening in South Korea? And it was like, for a minute, I forgot that the US really loves South Korea and is trying really hard to get South Korea to attack North Korea. But for some reason, I kind of thought like maybe they were giving South Korea a break for a couple of months because they were paying so much attention to other, but apparently not. So what the devil? What is going on in South Korea?
Right. So basically, this was, earlier this month, essentially first the president temporarily issued martial law. There was immediate pushback from the legislature and from the people. He was then impeached. He went on to be impeached. And last time I checked, there could have been an update, but it is still going through the courts at this point. They only have 6 of the 9 judicial appointments filled at this time. And so some of the things I was reading was saying that they may have to wait for those other 3 positions to be filled. But essentially, the people have spoken. The legislative branch has spoken. And I just want to read something quickly from Nadatal, who is this amazing organization that is against aggression against North Korea. They're for the end of the Korean War, because as we know, the Korean War is still ongoing. Because Korea is still divided between North and South Korea, the war has not officially ended. In fact, the Korean War, there was an armistice, right? Or there was a ceasefire, but the war has never formally ended. And so this organization has been pushing for an end to the Korean War, for an anti-imperialist understanding of what's happening in Korea. And so I just want to read a little bit about their analysis of what's happening. They said, despite years of anti-Yoon protests and vocal concerns from South Korean society about the character of his rule, the U.S. uncritically embraced Yoon as a key ally. This reflects the larger history of the U.S.-South Korea relationship, which has long been characterized by Washington's unwavering support for brutal military regimes in South Korea. Yoon's bid for martial law was an attempt to return to this bloody history. Yoon nodded to this history in his initial declaration of martial law when he claimed a need to eliminate pro-North Korean forces. This rhetoric echoes that of past military dictatorships in South Korea, who have used the unfinished Korean War as a justification to commit heinous crimes against humanity. Since its founding in 1948, South Korean regimes have repeatedly used martial law to massacre hundreds of thousands of people, beginning with the Jeju massacre of the 1940s and most recently with the 1980 Gwangju massacre. In all instances, popular movements for sovereignty, liberation, and dignity were branded as enemy agents using anti-communist and anti-North Korean rhetoric, end quote. Now,
that's the playbook.
Right.
And so we also need to be following this closely, because everybody keeps talking about fascism, right? Nascent fascism, proto-fascism, rising fascism, actually existing fascism in this country. And if that is the case, martial law is concomitant with that, right? And so we really need to be studying people's movements that have contended with this reality, especially as that is where we may be moving. And the other thing I think that's noteworthy about what's happening in South Korea is the strength of their people's movement and the relative autonomy of their legislative branch from the executive branch, unlike here. And so this is also something that we need to consider. We always talk about a duopoly, but it's not only that we have, a one-party state with two factions, but also that we ostensibly have checks and balances. But really the way, the three branches of government here have generally worked in concert to uphold whatever the reigning approach is. Even with a Warren court, for example, even with a relatively quote unquote progressive branch, they've worked together through action and inaction to mutually reinforce the status quo. And so again, we really need to be paying attention to what's happening right now in Korea, because this is a successful, at least for now, a successful sort of pushback against what's happening there.
I think too, this is kind of related to the popular front. To the popular culture tie-ins, right? So I think over the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of popular culture coming out of South Korea, talking about the kind of condition of life in South Korea, right? Which is really pushing back against this sort of neoliberal turn that happened in the 1970s, which really sort of resulted in Korea being this place that has one of the highest suicide rates in the world, because so much of the way the neoliberal capitalist imposition, that system being imposed, is so antithetical to some of the sort of ways that people have existed culturally long before that, right? And so I think the new Squid Games just came out, but Squid Games, what was the other one? Parasite, all of these, this particular, I think there was a surge in the last couple of years of popular culture coming out of South Korea that was really not depicting what I think we mostly get fed is, the life and the experience of South Koreans. And so to your point, Sharice, about the movement of people from the ground, which is very different from what we sort of see at the state level, is seen through, I think, this burst or this boom of proliferation of really critical popular media that has come out of South Korea in the last couple of years.
And I think that raises a really good question for me when we're talking about South Korean popular media. That's a different thing. Popular media is a different thing. In this one context in particular, but it's a very different thing from popular media that we experience here in this country. why is that? How and I'm not even sure I know how to ask this question, but because it seems like in order to peddle your entertainment in US markets, it has to meet certain standards, right?
Mhm.
Like a pro-Marxist movie is not going to be shown on Netflix.
Mm.
Unless of course it's a movie that is supposed to be a fictionalized autobiography of Marx that contains a bunch of shit that's actually not true and is kind of scandalous because such a movie does exist. But anyway, how do you think it is that this kind of pro-people, anti-capitalist, pro-organizing popular media from South Korea made its way into US entertainment like how did they slip it in without the gatekeepers knowing? Do you know what I mean? Because if we understand that we know that people have been trying to make a movie about the Haitian Revolution forever, and it cannot get made in this country because of white supremacy, imperialism, capitalism, all of that stuff. If this popular media that frames South Korean society as grossly unequal because of capitalism and imperialism, how'd they slip that into Netflix in Squid Game and Parasite and what's the other one? Sweet Home. I love that show. How did that happen?
Well, I mean, I number one, I don't know if the majority or plurality of people would necessarily even see it through an anti-imperialist or anti-capitalist lens. Like, so Squid Game, for example, it's possible, right? But it's also like a game show, you know, it's a game show where people are dying and we've normalized death and violence in this country. And so, but also we have to understand that capital also both it funds its own opposition and also appropriates or co-ops to mollify. So this is why we can have a certain number of radicals in academia, which is the intellectual arm of the state. And so you can let a few things in, I think, without actually upsetting the apple cart. I think it is, right? Because we also have like Sorry to Bother You, like Boots Riley's show, right? So there are certain sort of anti-capitalist or straight up socialist types of shows there. I think that they're sparse enough that we can accommodate a few, but also that I would say the political consciousness or the anti-capitalist consciousness is so low, or a Marxist iteration of anti-capitalism. I think a quotidian or everyday like fuck capitalism is there, but like that the access to sort of understanding media in that way is not very high, so it's not very threatening. And I'm thinking about this alongside like the Luigi Mangione thing, right? The ways that anti-capitalism or this as a sort of blow against capitalism is even being articulated, because even as people are talking about class consciousness, is so much ensconced in individualism and celebrity culture and like the great man notion of history, that it shows the sort of distorted way we understand or misunderstand class in this country.
Somebody in the chat also mentioned a great movie that was turned into a great movie with a great argument for socialism, Snowpiercer. That was turned into a really unfortunate and messy TV series. But anyway, enough about pop culture stuff, because I was just really curious because I as I'm watching the news about South Korea play out, and I'm seeing once again, because this isn't the only time the South Korean workers stood up and stopped their government from brutal repression of them. So I'm looking at this and I'm like, what is going on in South Korea that we need to be paying more attention to? That's right. Like when I see that kind of consistent grassroots activism, engagement, and commitment to resisting the government, I always be like, okay, what are we doing wrong? And or why are they able to do it and we do not seem to be able to do as much of that? And And then, of course, I start thinking about, well, yeah, I guess we probably, they're so indoctrinated that we do not get that workers in other countries really do take their agency very seriously. And we're very much indoctrinated not to. But beyond that, like, what are your kind of final thoughts on, like, how do we look at what is going on in South Korea for organizing our people, workers here?
I mean, I think, even part of the whole impetus of us doing this kind of rundown of the year in terms of what's happening is that if we really do believe in the kind of cliche phrase that all oppression is connected, then then understanding anywhere, whether it be African people or not, but anywhere where people are actually working to bring down these global structures of oppression will be able to have an impact. If that impact is something small, from just like people seeing that, oh, perhaps this is possible, to other kinds of like domino effects in terms of supply chains and being able, to disrupt sanctions that certain countries are imposing, right? So I think that the more that we understand that the way that capitalism, imperialism works is that it works internationally. And so anywhere throughout the world where people are working to bring it down makes it easier in other places to be able to do that. And because we know as African people, the masses of African people, we have been and continue to be among the most exploited in those situations, then that always will impact us, right?
I mean, I just want to end with the demands of, and Erica put in the chat, I think it's not a
me and this Americanized lazy ass Southern tongue.
Y'all know what I meant. They along with a coalition of other anti-imperialist organizations have 4 demands: U.S. out of Korea, in the U.S.-South Korea alliance, end all aggression against North Korea, and in the war economy. We can easily replace Korea with Africa, right? U.S. out of Africa, U.S. out of everywhere. In the U.S.-AFRICOM, our alliance with various neo-colonial powers on the continent, end all aggression against Cuba, Venezuela, anywhere that has any type of non-aligned or socialist or anti-American government. And then in the war economy, that affects everyone. And so to see that these are demands that are our demands, right? Even if they're specified to a particular locality, like these are our demands. This matters to us. So, yeah.
Well, speaking of places where the U.S. is trying to maintain its stronghold, or actually not even trying to maintain it, trying to get it back. Our next in the list is Venezuela. And so this year we know that the Venezuelan elections happened, obviously, and it has been an ongoing set of struggles to accept what the Venezuelan people have decided. And so what I want to do is share a couple of things. So one of our members from the AAPRPGC was an election observer this year. And so we have a really kind of extensive report back from their experience going to observe the elections. And I've also been invited to observe the inauguration in January, which is going to be happening actually around the same time as the US inauguration. But one thing that I think is interesting, and I'll talk about it more in this context, but I'll talk about it when we talk about Cuba also. So I recently went to Cuba. And one thing that I didn't actually realize is that at the moment, it is actually more difficult to travel from the US to Venezuela than it is to travel from the US to Cuba. Because I was able to get a flight from Boston to Miami to Havana. Right now, in trying to plan for the January inauguration, there are no options to fly directly from the US to Venezuela. And so trying to figure out what country, what routes are able to do that is yet another signal of where of what the nature of the sanctions are and what the status of the sanctions are. So I'm not going to talk too much about Cuba right now because I am going to talk about it later. But one of the things that I think is really important about the Venezuelan elections this year, and just really sort of in the scope of the sort of Bolivarian revolution over what now, so 98, so what, going on 25, 26 years. I can't do math. So one of the things that was mentioned, so since Hugo Chavez was elected in 98, Venezuela has had 31 national elections in the past 26 years. All but 2 of those elections have been won by largely by Chavista forces in the country. I think at the height of Chavez's presidency, he had numbers in the like upper 70s, low 80s in terms of, voting percentages, approval ratings. Obviously, Maduro has come into power with a very different economy, a very different world, very different set of understandings about, what the country is. But the fact that the Chavista government has been able to continue to win elections, I think proves what the sort of popular support is for the Bolivarian project, even despite all of the pressures, the sanctions, the inability to import goods. I think we've talked about this on the show before, but just the sort of declining infrastructure because of the inability to import parts and other kinds of things, the inability of the Venezuelan government to do business with so many other countries because of the sanctions again. But yet, even in spite of all of these things, the Venezuelan government continues to have the overwhelming, majority support of the Venezuelan people. But what I think is also important about why this particular election was such a battleground is that, it was Maria Machado who was trying to sit for the elections this term, right? And so the Venezuelan National Assembly determined that she was not going to be able to sit for this particular set of elections. One, because they had determined that she had been involved in the 2002 coup attempt against Chavez. And she had been involved in other attempts to upset the National Assembly. She has been one of the sort of main figureheads putting out propaganda against Diosdado Cabello, who was in charge of the PSUV. He's no longer in charge. He's still high ranking, but he's not in charge of the PSUV now. But I don't know if you all recall during the pandemic, there was when the U.S. government put Diosdado Cabello and Maduro on the FBI's most wanted list and put out like $1 million, $20 million.
Yeah, the bounty on them or whatever.
Their heads, and she was one of the primary contributors to that line of questioning, right? And so a part of what the National Assembly determined was that she's actually has been actively working against the benefit of the Venezuelan people for all this time. And so understanding that her attempt to run for president was yet another attempt to bring U.S. influence back into the Venezuelan national territory or whatever, right? So yes, Maduro winning was a win for the Bolivarian government, but it was also a win against this sort of struggle to intensify U.S. imperialism in Latin America, right? And so that's where I want to start and let other folks kind of chime in.
Well, so I just have a question. So I think that his win is clear, but it's not overwhelming.
Yeah,
right?
It's not,
So 6 million votes to 5 million. So what, why is it so close? Like, what is contributing to like Maduro's waning, I guess, influence? What is this? I don't know if this is a right wing guy, if it's another socialist person, but like, what is contributing to his declining influence and perhaps more, not unlike this country, more sort of nostalgia for like a non-socialist or for a more right-wing sort of government?
I don't know that it's a nostalgia for a right-wing kind of government, but I do think the sanctions, I mean, there is a very, very real shift in the quality of life for people in Venezuela that, like, I think I mentioned this before, like I remember the Venezuelan metro system was very clean, efficient, fast during the years when I spent the most time there, which is like between 2011 and 2015 is where I spent the most time. And this is, in the middle of that is when Chavez died. But I think when I went in 2019, I've mentioned before that there were just so few people on the road. Like just people not, and I was asking people like, what is this? Is this a result of, the sort of mass exodus? And people say, people have left, but it's less a result of the mass exodus, but more a result of the fact that because of the sanctions, they can't import parts to keep cars on the road. They can't import parts to keep the trains running, right? And I think that because a place like Cuba has been dealing with these sanctions for so long, they've really developed systems to be able to counteract that. Whereas Venezuela was, because of its oil wealth, was really sort of rapid. It was a cosmopolitan. I won't say it was, like it's not anymore, but you know, it was technologically advanced, cosmopolitan, all these kinds of things. And so I think people really saw a rapid decline in quality of life in terms of access to healthcare, education, all these kinds of things. And so I think that there has long been, even inside of the PSUV, even inside of the sort of Chavista forces, there's the support for Maduro has always been kind of shaky. For a number of reasons. I think one, you know, he was Chavez's chosen successor, so I think people wanted to go that way, but he has not, I mean, but people do like the strong man, right? And Maduro doesn't have the strong man charisma that Chavez had, but I think that more than anything else, there's actually been a rapid decline in the material conditions of life, and people want to see the Venezuelan government do things like diversify the GDP. Like, so much of the GDP comes from oil wealth, and so that means every time prices fluctuate, people feel it in a real sense, like every day. Like, again, like we see Caracaso style inflation and people kind of rising to this, going to the streets because of these inflations happening. And I think that people feel like not enough is being done to kind of counter, because like we know what the issues are, right? And so I think that has a lot to do with the waning support, even though it's kind of still there. And I also think there are some fractures. There are not as many fractures on the left as there are on the right. But there are some fractures on the left, and not so much people moving away from socialism, but people just saying, okay, there have to be other ways to do these kinds of things.
Yeah, it's, you know, when we talk about the sanctions, it's one thing to talk about them and to, you know, to be clear about what they are. This is not just some benign policy that's, you know, some legalese on a piece of paper that just gets pushed around. And no, these are things done to countries' economies. This government says, oh, it's targeting this person or this company, but really it is targeting the people of that society. And we don't really see that those of us who are in this country and who don't travel, right there, who don't travel. And I understand economically under capitalism, that means a whole lot of us ain't going nowhere because we cannot afford traveling from the United States anywhere else in the world is ridiculously expensive, prohibitively so. But when you travel to other places from other places in the world, you notice how affordable it is. That it is. So when we say that it is too expensive for Americans to travel to see the world, we're really not making this up. But for those of us who are able to do it, like on these delegations that we get invited to, or, you know, going on the brigades to some of these countries that you can participate in so you can see these things, seeing the result of the sanctions and the impact it has on people, that's a different thing. Because when I went to Venezuela in 2022, and that was the 10th and 20th anniversary of the reversal of the 2002 coup, to see the capital city have like the typical capitalist kind of things, like, you know, there's a in the nice hotel that we were staying in the middle of Caracas, there was a mall attached to the hotel was attached to the mall, and there's a Pizza Hut in the mall, a Burger King, a KFC, and I'm like, I did not come all the way over here
and they've been there and they've never gone anywhere. And so, and that's the thing, right? Because they always have accused the Venezuelan government of like just kicking. A lot of people, again, from the left have said they didn't do enough. They didn't clean house enough.
Right. They didn't expropriate any of the rich people.
Yeah.
Right. They didn't.
Nationalization without expropriation is not really a winning strategy.
And that's the thing. Like, I was literally sitting in my hotel room in the middle of the night, like, what did I just see walking into this hotel? Because what happens is, because of all of these restaurants, chain restaurants, they put out their garbage at night. And because of the sanctions and the inability of the government to do the things that they have been doing that Chavez started, like the food distribution program to the rural areas and that type of thing, Well, the government doesn't have as much money to do as much of that the way it was. And so more people are hungry.
Mm-hmm.
So what you might see is at night, people literally going through the garbage from these restaurants because capitalists all over the world do what capitalists do. They throw shit away. The stuff that should not be thrown away because they're so when you see that and it's like, oh, this is what sanctions do.
Yeah.
This is it. This is what sanctions do. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, wait a minute. When I go home to Southeast DC, from the airport to my house, I'm going to see people living in tent cities, people digging through the trash. So how am I learning about what's going on in Venezuela and not understanding that this government is doing the exact same thing to the people in Venezuela that they're doing to us right here in our neighborhoods? So it's like seeing it all of a sudden makes it more not real, but you get it. You absolutely get it. And then hopefully, if you have the experience, then you realize, oh, wait, sanctions are imposed on us too. How do we explain that? You know what I mean?
And just before we move on from this, I just want to read one last quote from that report. And just to give a sense of like the extent of the sanctions, right? So despite facing a barrage of economic challenges, including 930 unilateral corrective measures, which are sanctions, the Venezuelan people have shown remarkable resilience. These sanctions are a form of economic warfare. According to economist Jeffrey Sachs, this campaign of economic terror has resulted in at least 40,000 deaths in Venezuela. And yet, under Maduro's leadership, the country has seen impressive economic growth, plummeting inflation rates, significant strides in food sovereignty. And the food sovereignty is a huge one in a country that is actually really like the metro area of Caracas is highly populated, but as a country, Venezuela is actually an extremely underpopulated country. The economy has grown at an average of 4% per year. Inflation has dropped to its lowest rate in 39 years, and 85% of food consumed is now locally grown. And that was one of the major sort of fighting points for a lot of people about sort of diversifying the economy. So just wanted to point some of those things out too in terms of the strides that are being made.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the other thing that needs to be mentioned is then because of sanctions and because of its economic effects, you have mass migration to the U.S. And then we see the demonization of particularly Venezuelan and Haitian people, migrants, right? And people believe all of these stories about Venezuelan migrants because they believe all of these stories about Venezuela because they believe all of these stories about socialism. So it's mutually constitutive, the effects of sanctions and propaganda, right? And the material effects of both.
I feel like we need an infographic for what you just said, Sharice. I feel like I need that. I need it on a t-shirt. I need it on mugs. I need it on posters. I need it. We paste it everywhere so people can get that.
Right. See, this is why we need people who know how to do social media. I know how to do none of those things.
I'm gonna talk to the comrades in Parker, see what we can do.
Right. Okay, but related to what's happening in Venezuela is actually what's happening in Martinique, specifically the untenable economic situation. And so in September and October of this year, what we saw in Martinique was uprisings, people's uprisings, specifically against hyperinflation, and then the repression of those uprisings, which then led to another wave of protests. And so during September, thousands and thousands of people took to the streets in response to the escalating prices of food and other consumer goods. And what's important about this is that Martinique is a department of France. We can just say a neo-colony, right? It's basically, so these are, during the era of decolonization, there are many places like Martinique, Réunion, et cetera, that decided to kind of stay on as extensions of the French Empire. But food prices in Martinique are on average 40% higher than those in France. And so these protests are not only a protest of the material conditions, but also the colonial and dependent relationships that have continued on since the supposed end of colonization. And so after this first wave of uprisings that happened in September, riot police from France came to Martinique to put down the unrest, brutalized workers, of course, because the workers had organized specifically under an organization called Assembly for the Protection of Afro-Caribbean Peoples and Resources. They had organized strikes and basically a workers' movement. So after this first round of repression, people rose up at an even higher level, starting on October 9th, to shut down the airport. And then that unrest led to, this is one of sort of the largest uprisings that had happened since the 1950s. Related to this, right? So basically, the first thing is throughout the world, workers in particular, the masses are rising up against the untenable living situation. But France in particular is getting their ass whooped. So they got kicked out of the Sahelian states, right? The AES states. There was this uprising. Senegal.
They're changing the CFA.
There was this uprising in Martinique. But then remember, there was an uprising in New Caledonia. Right, and the French sent in troops there as well because they were France was trying to impose the ability of non-Indigenous folks to vote because New Caledonians have been pushing more and more for sovereignty and for independence. And so we just see France getting their ass whooped all over the place, which explains in part Macron's like tone deaf recent comments when he was in Mayotte, y'all know I don't know pronounce it. Mayotte. Which is it's an offshoot of Mozambique that is also a French department where he went and basically said, we know y'all got fucked up on these cyclones, but and we haven't done much for you. But if it weren't for colonialism, basically, you all would be way worse.
It would be so much worse.
So much worse. And so what we're seeing is that France is losing its grip on its neo-colonies. It is losing its grip on any pretense of being a benevolent or civilizing power. And so this is happening in Africa, in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, and this is a net positive for African people everywhere.
Ooh, here's a question. Do you think that there is coordination among those groups of people that you just mentioned who are all coinky-dink, all rising up against the French former colonists? Or is it not a coincidence and it's the result of international solidarity?
The thing is, I feel like it has to be both, right? There's never like the fact that Nkrumah was on his way to Vietnam when he was overthrown, right? There's not been a time in the sort of post-imperial, post-colonial moment where there has not been some degree of collusion about what it means to get out from under the stronghold of our imperial oppressors, right? Wherever they are, right? Whether, I think I remember reading something years ago where like when Chavez was a young military combatant, he was like in the same spaces and with like, what's his name from Ecuador? Correa from Ecuador. Like there was just this moment in time where as young men they were in these different meeting spaces, or like when you think about what is it, the black student in France, right, where all of these what do you call it, colonized folks across Africa were meeting up in France and making decisions about, okay, this is what we're gonna go back to our home countries and do these things. So I have a hard time believing that there's not some degree of collusion. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's like mass collusion, right? Like all the people, but I think there has to be that. But I also think that like it's like one of those like a domino effect. Like when you see a chink in the armor, you gotta know like this is the time to take advantage of that. And I think one that my dad always argues about is like it's no coincidence that when Europe, because of Hitler, right? When Europe turned on itself to have to deal with its own shit, that was when the rest of the world was able to develop.
Well, that's like development, like the key underdevelopment argument of world systems.
And so seeing this happen right now as you know, as Mali, as Niger, as Burkina Faso, as all these countries are saying literally fuck France, what person in the right mind who is living under that and feeling the brunt of it wouldn't say, well, damn, if they did it, maybe it's possible for us to do some shit here too, right? Mm-hmm. So it obviously, to me, has to be a both and.
Yeah, and I don't think that we from the United States can have so much conceit as to know what people are doing on the ground and what conversations are being had among organizations. So like in the chat, it's like, no, these connections aren't being made. We don't know that. I do think so. A broader sort of anti-imperialist ideology might not be explicitly articulated, but with social media and all sorts of other connections, like I would be very shocked if these conversations aren't happening. Yeah. But in terms of more sort of organized, concretized movements, it seems to me that these things are on the horizon, especially as like the AES, for example, is setting the pace for what independence could look like. Right. For what a world beyond both French and US imposition could look like. And so I don't think they're completely disjointed, but we also don't want to impose, again, from the outside, our own like artificial connections of these things that are happening. But the connection is imperialism, and people are seeing that at least implicitly, because it's having a material effect on their lived realities, which is the basis for these strikes, these uprisings, these rebellions, and this sort of broader sentiment against French neocolonialism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad you made the point about the AES being, you know, kind of like the spark for a lot of people, maybe not everyone, but the spark for people to look and say, oh, maybe we can do that too. But we're going to talk more about the AES a little bit later. I just wanted to say before we move on to the next topic, I watched that the newsreel of the interview that Macron did. I don't know how that man got out of that crowd alive. I do not know.
There was this one lady in particular. She was like,
listen,
bruh.
She had in that crowd somewhere.
you know we are an upright people, because that man is still. They let him leave. Do you understand?
Oh my goodness! Yes.
So okay, so we've done the honorable mention. Which is a really great honorable mention. We've done Venezuela, Martinique, and now we're at number 8, which is just this. This is fascinating to me. I think this is such a fascinating thing that we weren't supposed to pay a lot of attention to it, but I think the implications are in everything else that is going on. So I don't know if people have realized, but for a few years now, ever since 2022, 2023, military recruitment for the United States has been abysmal. Mm-hmm. Why y'all kids ain't joining this military protecting this country? What is wrong with you? Well, God bless you, first of all.
I hope I'm playing my small role in influencing my students not to do that shit.
We don't
listen. I am not judging. Thank you. God bless you. Keep it up. That's what I say. But there is a big problem with the U.S. military being able to recruit more people to do the bloody footwork of imperialism. This is a problem for the empire because of places like Ukraine and Gaza, where the United States has sent military advisors allegedly to help explain to the Ukrainians how to fly the planes that the U.S. You cannot make this dumb stuff up. You can't make it up. And the U.S. has sent advisors in to do something with the floating pier that they said they create. Yeah, whatever. And now the U.S. And Israel and Turkey have couped Syria and are partitioning it right now. And there will be more. first the U.S. said they didn't realize, well, the spokespeople for the U.S. said, oh, we didn't know there were 1,000 U.S. troops in Syria. The Department of Defense knew that they put them there. They're there. That's, but they're going to need more. But they're going to have a problem maintaining, the U.S. empire is going to have a problem maintaining this 900 plus military bases around the world, maintaining these new scenarios of occupation, maintaining this their footprint in these countries now that they are not only providing military and materiel support for, but are sending troops in to provide what troops? Their goal for 2023 was what, 65,000, at least the army, 65,000 troops, nowhere near that many people. And this is fantastic for us because it shows me, I think, that the military propaganda of the military as a viable way to develop as a person, right? To remember the old military commercials, be all you can be. I'm fine, just exactly the way. I don't have to put on your uniform and go kill people to be all I can be. But that was the decades of marketing that the military had. The Marine Corps still has their ads that are very stirring and that, because I almost joined the Marine Corps when I was out of high school. I am so glad I dodged a lot. But you got the Marine Corps with their ads saying, you don't join the Marines, you become one, right? And it's very much this propaganda toward developing you as an individual. Reach the heights of who you can be as an individual through the military. And of course, the unwritten part, the fine print is every once in a while, we're going to call on you to kill a bunch of people who look like you in a country that you probably can't pronounce and didn't even know where it was. And because you signed this contract, you can't say no. That propaganda is no longer working on the current generation and the previous generation. I don't think these kids, they're like, fuck you and your be all you can be, fuck you and your poverty draft, fuck you and your militarism. And then they're starting to do something, they're going a little farther. People are starting to ask, why do I have to join the military in order to get healthcare, housing, and education? Right? So on the one hand, we've got a generation of younger people who are looking at the military and looking at all this extra ramped up, very hyper aggressive, very nebulous kind of threat inducing, fear inducing recruitment ads for the military. Basically saying that the entire world is against the United States, and if you want to fight these threats of the whole world against the United States, then join the team. And people are looking at this and saying that's bullshit. That is bullshit, because the rest of the world does not want to kill us all. They want you to leave them alone, right? And I think the military has realized they have they've screwed the pooch. They don't have messaging that works anymore. They can't get young people to join the military anymore. So that does, I won't say imperil, but it does impact how they're going to carry out their campaign of trying to maintain their hegemony. Will that mean they will rely less on boots on the ground in some places? Yes. But that does not mean that militarism will end or that the imperialist threat will end, because now we know that they will just use drones, right? But there will always be a need for people to occupy some space, to man the checkpoint, to do that kind of thing. But the U.S. military is having a problem recruiting people to do those things. So what happens now? when the empire can't rely on its oppressed citizens to be pressed into service to uphold the empire everywhere else in the world? What happens then? What part of the collapse of empire does this signal, do you guys think?
Well, I mean, I think a couple things. One, I think that, again, as I've said elsewhere, and I think I've said to YouTube, there's even fewer people who would be able to pass the written exam for the military or the physical exam. We are deeply unhealthy, very large, and I'm not being fat phobic. This is the reality, because this is not tied directly to capitalism, because they put high fructose corn syrup and wheat filler and preservatives and everything. So we're a deeply unhealthy society. This investment in education is palpable and real and has to do with changes in the organization of the economy. But related to that, I think that the perks that originally drew people to the military, like the GI Bill, like getting education in homes, they don't pay for the full thing. They give you a certain amount. And because of the skyrocketing cost of owning a home, of going to college, if those perks are not going as far as they once did. Moreover, less and less people are even interested in higher education, which, being a knowledge worker in higher education, is a complete shit show. So, so I do not blame people for not wanting to get a degree. But I think that part of that messaging too is that whatever the perks were, the sort of social perks of joining the military for a certain amount of years also just aren't, like this new generation is like, we're never going to own a home. Like, we are not going largely into debt to get this type of education that is to drive for Instacart. We're not doing that. So I just think that organization of society as well, or that the military is out of step with what is actually possible currently.
And I think that is definitely true for, like, what do they call, like, the entry level troops positions. But then we also see them recruiting at higher levels to bring folks in at officer ranks, right? And so folks who have gone to college would have, in a different economy, in a different time, have used whatever degree they had to do something else, are now seeing the military as a place. So I'm also wondering about that. And I wonder about that in particular as it relates to the proliferation of military recruitment, ROTC, and Homeland Security programs, all of those types of Homeland Defense programs that are proliferating at HBCUs in particular. And when you asked the question earlier, Jackie, like, what does this mean for us as African people, as Black people? That's something that, like, the amount of, like, I do see less and less military propaganda in general, but I see it so much on HBCU campuses. And that has to do with, like, the fact that most HBCUs in terms of finances, don't have a lot of big grant funding or whatever. And so they're getting it from allowing the State Department to come in and run these particular kinds of programs. And the Department of Defense to run these particular kinds of programs. And so while I am both excited about the reality that less people are entering into the rank and file membership of the military, I am wondering specifically, like, how we are looking at this particular phenomenon of trying to recruit the so-called, elite educated members of society into these officer positions in the military. And in some ways, being in those officer positions and in those higher ranking positions is much more egregious, because you're in decision-making capacities as opposed to just taking orders in terms of what it means to be taking these lives away, right? And then but the U.S. military has, for a long time, not been a military of physical might. It's been a military of technological might, right? So the increasing sort of drone programs. So these are things that I'm thinking about at the same time as there is this reality that there are less and less people being recruited into the rank and file membership.
But also too, when we talked about entertainment earlier, there's so much propaganda and military propaganda. You cannot get away from it. Every show is FBI, CIA, military, etc. So there is that socialization in that regard, which dovetails with the shift in the disposition of military warfare to like drones. Somebody mentioned video games in the chat, that sort of thing. So there is that socialization into sort of war making, right? And militarism in that regard. That's beyond. And also the NFL, they still have it's like gross militarism from the commercials and the Jesus commercials, the new ones, like Jesus got you. The Jesus commercials and the military commercials, but then they always have this elaborate ROTC thing, right? And so there's different codifications of militarism that people into at least the sort of mentality of, or the enticement of being, fucking Jason Bourne or whatever, I don't know, in the military.
Wait, Musa said that military recruitment is also now targeting populations 13 to 17. What is what is
so that? This is how they do this, and I'm so glad he brought this up.
They still can't enlist prior to
they can get commitments from these kids. Yeah, and their parents, because they make a big deal. Oh, this is completely above board. We get your parents to sign. So what they've done, and I noticed this a couple of years ago, is they have these like gaming tournaments. The military is an enormous sponsor of a lot of these gaming tournaments that I did not know were as big as they are. Tournaments that I did not realize were that a lot of them are happening at schools, like public schools, high schools, middle schools, or the military itself is bringing its own little, gaming display, whatever, to a school to have a little tournament or whatever as a means to recruit middle school kids, even if there is no ROTC in that school. But of course, there's always ROTC. Right.
Yeah, it's called junior ROTC.
Right. Junior ROTC. Right. Right. I was in junior ROTC in high school. That's how I almost got almost joined the
4-H clubs also kind of tied into
and Girl Scouts.
Yeah.
Yep. 4-H clubs, Girl Scouts. Yes. Yes. And it's really messed up because I'm a country girl. I was in 4-H. And I didn't understand until later. Well, I don't need y'all telling me how to love the land. I'm a country girl. I love the land. I don't need you in your imperialist bullshit, telling me how to come out of it, because that's really what 4-H is. 4-H teaches kids agricultural skills, and they frame it as taking care of the land, but really they're teaching you how to capitalize and commodify agriculture. That's what 4-H does. And yeah, it's just as bad as everything else.
Well, speaking of military and circling back to Latin America, next up on our list is Cuba. Oh Lord. That's not even that many open.
Oh, you can't find your tab.
Oh, yeah, it's right here. That's
okay.
Okay. So Erica in the chat mentioned that she and I were both in Cuba recently. So first, well, let me not even start there. So first, obviously, Cuba has had a rough fucking year. It's been a rough year, right? So if I'm not mistaken, Cuba has had 2 major hurricanes, 2 earthquakes, and 3 major power grid failures. But what I think is really interesting about where Cuba is now, and particularly in relationship to the question of us as African people, is that even in the midst of dealing with all this, Cuba hosted a group of young people from the AES, from the Alliance from Sahel States. They hosted a banned books conference sponsored by Morgan State there. Erica and I were at this Decade for People of African Descent, this conference on equity, social justice, and equality. And so I want to say a little bit about that. And so this is actually a really kind of like interesting closing the circle for me personally, because 2011 was the first year I went to Venezuela. In 2011 was the first year the UN declared an international year for people of African descent. And then after that, the UN declared 2015 to 2024, the International Decade for People of African Descent. And there have been, and obviously the UN is what it is as an entity, as an organization. But what I think is interesting, and this kind of goes back to our conversation about are people making these connections on the ground? A lot of what has happened as a result of the UN declaration is that it has created one, funding opportunities, but also like just occasions and opportunities for states to become for different countries to become involved in projects that allow the African and African descendant populations to bring their issues to the fore. And so thinking about Cuba as a place that is both like a bastion of socialist, communist, leftist politics, and even for the sort of African independence movement, but also has had a really kind of contentious relationship with Blackness and race, right? Because in the history of Cuba, right, it was historically outlawed to create political parties or organize on the basis of race, which is both a tie to the kind of history of like whitening or sort of racial sciences that exist in Latin America, but also on the sort of left side of that, it was believed that trying to organize on the basis of race would create divisions inside of the left that would do more harm to the revolutionary project of Cuba than not. But recently, what we've seen is really a kind of a walking back of that, right? An acknowledgement by civil society organizations, social movements like the Red Barrial, but then also there is this Color Cubano, these sort of state commissions that are attempting to both track and think about what are the sort of racialized disparities that people of African descent are experiencing, but with the support of the government, right? Because what we've also seen happen in the Cuban case a lot is that people who are not necessarily supporters of the revolutionary project bring issues of race to bear as a way of condemning or trying to weaken the support or undermine the support for the revolutionary project. And so at this moment when we are seeing the Cuban government take up this issue of race, I think that this offers I think this is going to be like a kind of a turning point, a really kind of momentous point where we get to see, okay, now that countries like both Cuba and Venezuela are from the left taking up this issue, this question of race, and particularly this experience of people of African descent at the level of the state trying to deal with these things. Now can we talk through and work through real kinds of policies, real kinds of initiatives that change the material circumstances of people of African descent while still upholding the revolutionary project, right? Without being, a Carlos Moore reactionary, kind of a take, right? Or the way that in some instances, hip hop was kind of used as a subversive measure to kind of undermine the Cuban Revolution, because hip hop was one of the few avenues where people were able to kind of talk about racialized disparities in the Cuban context. And so I don't think it's insignificant that Cuba hosted this international conference in 2024, marking the end of the International Decade of People of African Descent. I think if my numbers are correct, there was something like, so the largest delegations were from the US and Togo. And I think that is, I was interested, like while we were there, about why the US is in the biggest numbers, but I think it makes sense that having to be able to have a visible support from people from the US with the particular imposition of the US imposing those sanctions, it sends a strong message to say the people in the US are not necessarily with what the government is doing, right? So I think that that's really important.
And it's our responsibility to agitate against,
absolutely.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
To lift up the blockade. Like exactly. We have a responsibility to work toward that tirelessly,
absolutely. And then Togo being, Togo is a interesting place, but but Togo being because Togo is supposedly the going to be the seat of the 9th Pan-African Congress, and because there was also these kind of preparatory meetings that happened all year long, the Robert Doucet was there, the Togolese delegation has utilized this conference as an opportunity to continue to make the particular issues of people of African descent in the diaspora a major platform agenda item on the 9th Pan-African Congress, right? And so a part of what came out of the sort of resolutions of this conference, one is that there will be another conference. So we reaffirm the need to continue to exchanging views on these ideas. to humanity, and consequently support the convening of the Executive Coordinating Group of the National Program Against Racism and Racial Discrimination, Color Cubano, to the International Conference, Cuba 2026, Thought and Action Against Racism, to be held in March 2026. They also mentioned, we welcome the initiative of the government of Togo in collaboration with the African Union to organize the 9th Pan-African Congress in Lomé, which is supposed to happen in December of next year. And again, you know, Togo, interesting place. The African Union, like all kinds of issues with the African Union. Mm-hmm. But I think that what is important about these spaces is that they allow people who are representatives of the government, who honestly, I met a lot of people at this conference in Cuba who they weren't representatives of the government. They had like governmental affiliations in different countries. Mm-hmm. Who just really needed to be in spaces where their ideas about what was happening in the rest of the world were being challenged. And so I think that this is what these types of conferences offer. And I think this is really, to me, this is a really exciting, jumping off point. The UN has now also declared a second international decade for people of African descent beginning in 2025. So there'll be another, bunch of successive sort of events that are going to occur. And so I think this was, I'm excited about what has come of this, but I also do want to say there was a point that you made earlier, Jackie, about what it means to feel the sanctions, and I don't want to ignore this. So when I have a close family friend who lives in Guanabacoa, which is on the sort of outskirts of Havana, and she's an engineer, worked in the Cuban government. A professional by all accounts, right? In early 30s. And when we first arrived in Cuba, so when did we arrive? I guess it was like December 9th or something like that. She came to visit us, and we were talking about just her everyday kind of life circumstances. And she was like, I still don't have power. And she was like, not only do we not have power, but then we often can't get gas. And if I can't get gas, then I can't cook. And, this is ostensibly, obviously they're not, Cuba is a country that doesn't try to make all these distinctions, but this is a professional working woman who is literally unable to have food and to make and have food. And so one of the questions that we were asking her when we were there, she was like, well, we're like, would it help, to gather resources, whatever. She's like, obviously anything helps. She's like, but the most important thing is that we want to live a life with dignity. We don't want to keep having to ask for people to bring things. We want to live in a country where we can get access to the things that we need to get access to live dignified lives, right? And so, while we were there, I think I don't know if I had a vegetable. Maybe I think I might have had some like tomatoes over the course of the week. And this was, a state-sponsored conference, and this is just evidence of like how imposing and dire the conditions are. People are really, really struggling. And so when we had the opportunity to have a press conference with the Cuban president, I was actually surprised because one, I was like, bro, you got a lot of things to be dealing with. You really have time.
You need to be over here.
But I also didn't realize that he had sent his wife to the conference. So she had been attending the conference the entire time, and she had been reporting back to him sort of every day. And so even with him dealing with the power grid failures, people still suffering because of the hurricane, the earthquake, all these things, for the Cuban government to say it's important enough for us to take this time to get a report back on what's happening with this particular conference so that we take this up at the level of the state, I think is just really an exciting and promising point to be at.
I just want to say, not to censure the U.S., but we live here. The U.S. is the fucking center of everything that's terrible in the universe. Cuba is a prime example of duopoly. And why is that so many of us on the left were saying that perhaps a slight qualitative shift will be manifested in a shift from one side of the regime or the other, but it's not a quantitative. It's not sort of it's difference in degree as opposed to kind, because Biden had every opportunity to take Cuba off of the state sponsored, state sponsored terror.
State sponsors of terror, yeah.
Biden had every opportunity to, right? So Obama normalized to some degree some relations. Trump undid that. Biden undid nothing that Trump did. Trump is coming back and will probably impose even more draconian policies and or just maintain the status quo, which, as you just described, is and Musa has been talking about in chat, is quite terrible.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we talk about there not being a difference between the two parties, this is what we mean.
Mm-hmm.
This is particularly what, and it's not just Cuba, it's Zimbabwe,
Mm-hmm.
it's Syria, it's Haiti, it's so many other places that when we look at the will to destroy people for the purpose of regime change, that is a bipartisan project.
Yeah, I can't help but think of this issue with Cuba focusing on this at the highest levels of government in a very public fashion, not only including members of Cuban civil society, but international partners. Like, how do you do all of that while you are undergoing like one of the most brutal material attacks on another country that another country can do, that is short of an all-out hot war, right? And I look at what Cuba has accomplished with this and what they're trying to accomplish, and I compare that to the conversations that, like what Sharice said, not to center this shithole, but I mean, we got to work with the white leftists, and they don't like talking about race, y'all. So how do we? I can tell you how I feel every time I have to have this conversation with leftists about, no, it's class and race. They are inextricably linked. We can't talk about one without talking about the other. This is why we keep saying this. I don't know what y'all problem is, but they keep coming back with, no, it's just class, and this identity politics stuff is gonna, derail us, and people aren't gonna do anything for us because of you blacks wanting to talk about black stuff. But you got a whole country under siege, dealing with their own internal contradictions. Other than that being the perfect example for the difference between a free society and a propagandized capitalist imperialist society that's a threat to everybody else in the world, what do we leftists do? What do we black leftists do with this very tenuous, tense, and very often useless relationship that I know that's not that we have with white leftists here, who don't see what Cuba is doing as anything that's worth them paying attention to, let alone listening to us when we're trying to raise these issues with our organizing here.
But I think Cuba's instructive in that regard, because that's precisely what we're seeing. We're seeing the upheaval of Afro-Cubans pushing back against white Cubans on the left who have historically felt like discussing issues of race were divisive, and actually coming to see that actually what Cuba will probably get, because of what's happening in the Sahel regions, because of what's happening all around the world, Cuba again taking this moment to take the issue of race seriously actually helps solidify the Cuban Revolution but to strengthen it because of it gaining support by people who are having those struggles.
Put this on the screen. Okay.
Because I saw the look on her face. I'm like, it's coming.
To talk about the specific ways that people racialized as Black, those of African descent, or those of African descent experience exploitation and oppression, is not identity reductionism. Identity politics is in fact important, because when we talk about sanctions, when we talk about imperialism, when we talk about something like super exploitation, race has been a way to intensify those experiences for those who are at the bottom. So it is not it's only divisive if those who do not experience the intensified effects continue to ignore them. That is a structural reality. That is a material reality. That is the economic reality. So stop with the identity politics bullshit. I don't give a fuck about that particular line of reasoning, because anybody who has done any modicum of organizing or who has talked to racialized people anywhere in the world, in a favela, in a garrison, in a township, in a urban area, in a ghetto,
Good.
you know that people who are racialized as Black and other racialized people broadly experience these things differently. So to sit here and say that identity politics is divisive, just objectively, so identity reductionism, sure, and this is why people like many people have made Erica Keynes, many people have written about this ad nauseum. The two are not the same. And to sit here and say to bite our tongues until we get socialism, that is, I'm just reading Harry Haywood, and essentially he was critiquing this in the 1940s because he said essentially the struggle for Black liberation is objectively revolutionary in a society that is built on enslavement and indigenous genocide. And to ask racialized people who experience things from lynching to mass incarceration to not organizing around things that satisfy their material conditions, like land, right, like food, like the ability to participate at least equally in a society, to ask them to set that aside to argue, to organize for socialism is an abstraction. And that the two are only at loggerheads when we don't understand the racialized effects, that is to say the material effects, the materiality of race as an ideology. So miss me with the bullshit.
And I just wanted to point out that Esme said, okay, good point. And I like that he said this because I'm going to tell you why in a minute. I just feel like capitalism is killing me more. If you are a racialized person in this capitalist society, yes, capitalism is killing your Black ass more. It is. It is killing more of our Black asses than it is of the other asses. It is, and it is killing, capitalism is killing more racialized asses than it is poor white asses. It's not that it's not killing the poor white asses. It is. But because of the intrinsic, foundational, racialized oppression within capitalism, it's a part of it. It's not like this separate thing that, you know, capitalism is over here and capitalism is fine. Capitalism is walking down the street, making friends with people. But then racism comes along and jumps on capitalism and turns capitalism evil. No, capitalism exists through the exploitation of people that it marginalizes. And one of the ways it marginalizes people is by racializing people. That's the justification for their marginalizing. We got to call them other than us in order to push them down to the bottom. So yes, capitalism is killing your Black ass and your indigenous ass and your First Nations ass and your Native Hawaiian ass and your immigrant ass more than other asses. Absolutely true.
And this is not, so you just got the smoke. This is not just to you. This is really to our so-called white friends on the left. Because with friends like these, who needs enemies? There is a reason why Harry Haywood and Claudia Jones and Walter Rodney and William Patterson and George Padmore and Kwame Ture, both Kwames. And there's a reason why we fundamentally understand why Africanness and Blackness as a structural reality, as a reality of imperial imposition and colonial and neocolonial imposition matters. And so it is only divisive because white people refuse to accept that as a central organizing principle. That is what is divisive. And you can run to that shit. But we're going to talk about Sudan now.
She said what she said. Let us move on.
So there is so much to say about Sudan. And so I'm not going to go into the whole overarching conflict, which dates back to the 2010s when South Sudan seceded from Sudan, from the 2020, when the interim government was put into place, the U.S. forcing Sudan to normalize relations with Israel, which then created the conditions for broader surveillance and repression of those who had been engaging in the 2018 uprising to overthrow Omar al-Bashir. So there's a whole context to what is happening currently that I won't go into, but suffice it to say, the main forces on the ground that are dispossessing, displacing, and in many ways exterminating the population are the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces. But primarily what I want to talk about with the Sudan conflict is that it has broadly been framed as a civil war. It is not a civil war. It is a proxy war that has domestic impact and implications that has, to be sure, neocolonial strongmen who are vying for power. But there are so many international actors who are backing both sides, who are attempting to jockey for position and for resources and control of Sudan. That is what is important. That is what I want us to focus on, up to and including recently, right? The US promised a Sudanese ambassador that it would talk to the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, about stop not sending weapons to the RSF. If we do not understand the fucking irony, the gall, and the absolute goofiness of that statement, when the US is the primary supplier of weapons to Israel to decimate the Palestinian population, then we can't even have a serious conversation about this. But what I want us to pay attention to is that Ukraine, for example, Ukraine has been responsible for not only machinations in the AES states, which we'll get to later on, but also in backing the RSF, because ostensibly the Wagner Group, a private Russian military force, is backing the SAF. The United States' hands are all up in it because they want to control particularly Western Sudan to be able to control oil resources. Countries like Egypt and the UAE want access to gold within the same Western region of Sudan. But the material effects of this globally backed proxy war are catastrophic. For example, there have been over 61,000 deaths in the Khartoum state alone since the start of the conflict, which, by the way, April 15th, 2023, that is the sort of the current iteration of the conflict, that there are 25 million people in Sudan who are in desperate need of assistance, food, water, medical care, and places to live. 18 million people are suffering from food deficits. Millions of people have been displaced, many of who have migrated or fled to Chad. And the other thing that I want us to think about is why this is not top of mind for us, right? It has been more when people are intentionally making the connections between, for example, Palestine and Sudan and Congo and Haiti. People try to throw other bullshit in there. I'm not even going to mention these other conflicts that do not fit this. I'm not even going to do that. But I think, when we talk about anti-Africanness, right? When we talk about anti-Blackness in a material way, right? And not in this sort of ontological or just simply ideological way, there is a reason why these conflicts that happen in African countries are naturalized, normalized, and legitimated, not only so that various, states and private actors can continue to plunder these countries, but also because we think that this is the natural state for African people. And it's true domestically and in our domestic colonies, and it is true on the African continent. We think that this is just what Africans do because we never should have freed them niggas. We never should have let them run their own societies. They're all neo-colonial strongmen, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, as if the African masses who bear the brunt of this over and over don't matter. And so I wanted to raise that, and I love to hear what you ladies think about Sudan.
No, I'm glad that that you put this up on the screen, because this actually was going to be the question that I asked about this situation in Sudan. Because if people pay attention to just the continent, just in a general kind of sense, they know they had never heard of a South Sudan before 2011. So the idea of there being a conflict, a proxy war in Sudan, that a South Sudan was created in the first place by US imperialism, and the reason there is this continued unrest and conflict and proxy war is because of US imperialism. So I'm just like, man, so which iteration of imperialism are we missing to have gotten to this point and not realized what was done, right?
I mean, I think, you know, as the South Sudan declared its independence, you know, so much of it was sort of reminiscent of the Congo, right, and the Katanga province, right, under Lumumba, right, and I think, like, if you know, for me as a Pan-Africanist, if the goal is unity, there always have to be questions about the creation of further balkanization. Right, the creations of new microstates, and in whose interest, right? And you know, what is it like with the Sahrawi people? Like there are some distinctions, some other kinds of things that are happening, right? But anytime we see the actual full-on creation of new nation states in territories that are mineral rich, that are in contention, we always have to ask more questions about who does this benefit? And the vast majority of the time, it does not benefit the people to create smaller and smaller entities that are controlled by different places, and where particular mineral resources can be plucked off or can be extracted with less and less regulations, with any kinds of understanding of how those resources need to be shared and be accountable to the people who live on those lands, right? And so for me, it's just always a red flag, right? Like if there is some new independence movement burgeoning in this particular era, this epic of life, there just has to be so many more questions that I think not enough of us ask.
Well, part of what's also being said is that there are talks of secession of the western part of Sudan that's under RSF control, and of course, this got Western, other Southwest Asian, other types of interests written all over it, right? But of course, we focus on the primary contradiction, which is U.S. imperialism. But I also think that part of it, I share your suspicion of these different secessionist movements. At the same time, that we also need to think about the ways that so many neo-colonial contradictions are not resolved, and so the ethnic conflicts that are often at the sort of the foundation of many of these secessionist movements are because flag independence and national states were imposed on top of some ethnic groups which were wholly created, right, by colonialism, the spatialization of race, the way that happened under colonial regimes, and then the sort of installing of neo-colonial puppets alongside the overthrowing of socialist and non-aligned leaders in that in that post-independence moment, and how these things continue to be unresolved, right? And it reminds me of what was being said in the chat about Cuba, about it's not, the socialist project wasn't an evasion of race per se, but it was a failure to contend with its legacy from the Batista regime and from the realities of enslavement, you know, so because Cuba was relatively after the US, right? I think even after Brazil, or maybe slightly before Brazil.
Cuba and Brazil were the last two,
right, to end slavery. And so when we don't have real autonomy, when we don't have real self-determination and sovereignty, these are the things that happen. And so, like, you know, but I think for me, Eritrea was an example to me of a sovereignty that was necessary, that is not neo-colonial. It's the only place on the US, on the African continent that does not have a US military base. Although, you know, that's being rapidly changing as the AES and other countries rise up. And so I think that we need to take that into account as well. But the other thing I want to say is, like, what was difficult for me, and even looking up Sudan, is like who to believe, because there's Amnesty International, there's so much US Human Rights Watch all up in this. There's so many influencers, right? Which on the one hand, you know, the infographics are easy to consume. On the other hand, it's like, who is paying these people, and what are their actual politics? When it's like, believe people on the ground, who? Because if you say believe people on the ground in the United States, are you talking about a fucking Trumper? Are you talking about a Negro liberal?
A white Miami Cuban?
A white Miami Then or is it people like us? And so I think it becomes very difficult to even have a correct analysis, or even just a true analysis of what's actually happening. And especially because in the United States, we're acculturated to treat everything as a versus battle. Who do we Who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? And because neocolonialism makes things so much more complicated than that, and especially in this Sudanese context. So I just want to read. Sorry, go on, Jackie.
No. I'm providing the comic relief.
I just want so Salome. I don't know how to say Salome's last name. So Big Salome, the big homie in BAP Atlanta, did an interview with the African Watch Bulletin, which is the BAP US out of Africa Network newsletter, where she talks about this, right? She was asked, they were asked, why is there so little known about what's happening in Sudan? And they said the current lack of attention to the war in Sudan can be attributed to several factors. First, there's a lack of knowledge and political education regarding the Horn of Africa overall, which results in limited public interest and discourse. Understanding the current war requires a deeper grasp of Sudanese history beyond humanitarian statistics, which many people do not even have the inclination to explore in this era of quick information. To truly comprehend the present moment, studying the history of Sudan is necessary rather than relying solely on social media graphics that conveniently appear on our feeds. This is especially crucial considering the lack of access to internet and telecommunication tools in Sudan, making it challenging, if not impossible, for everyday people to document the war for the Western audience. Furthermore, the absence of a strong international movement in solidarity with Sudan contributes to its limited visibility in global discourse. Historically, much of the international discourse on Sudan has been controlled by neoliberals such as the Clooneys and Clintons, who dictate to those in the West, particularly in the US, when and how to quote unquote save Sudan, or more specifically Darfur. The ongoing wars in the Sudan, from the first Sudanese civil war, which began 1 year before the 1956 flag independence, up until 1982, and the second civil war from 1983 to 2005, have also led to a desensitization among many who may view it as just another African country at war, thereby diminishing the significance of the present popular uprisings turned war, because armed forces who are all in opposition to the most important groups in this fight, which are the interests of the masses of the Sudanese people. If we claim to be pro-African, in this fight, if we claim to be pro-African peoples, we must amplify all struggles of African peoples toward liberation. If we don't know enough about the struggles, then we must study it so we have correct analysis to stand in real solidarity. So it's a much longer interview, but I just wanted to read that part by Salome because I think it's really, really important, not only about Sudan, but about Congo and many other conflicts that are happening on the African continent.
So can I ask a follow-up question about that then, just for the audience? So then our job is to study, right? And to consume a bunch of different things. So then how do we help people? How do we help ourselves discern because you're saying this is the problem, right? The problem is that there's so many different takes. What is it that allows you or as an individual or other people to say, okay, this take seems like one that I might lean into? Like how do you discern that for yourself?
That was from BAP. It literally is. It's like if it's in BAP, communist, it's circulated by people I trust. I'm not gonna lie though, like one of the people that I do follow, I don't know their politics, but it's at BS on Blast. Her name is Sada. I don't know their politics, but they at least give a day by day, a play by play of what's happening on the ground, and then from there, having my own ideology, I can discern. These are the different sort of contradictions. These are the different forces that are at play, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that I'm just starting with Black Agenda Report. And going from there.
I think that matters because I also think that's just a question that for at least us, I think us as educators, even Jackie, you as a media personality, my students are always there like, how do I know what to believe? There's so many things, and it's like I think being in community and conversation about things like it's you can trust your own analysis, but also like we're doing these things in community, so it does matter to get other perspectives about well, this part of that line of argument seems sketchy because blah 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 blah. And I think and that is a skill. That is a a muscle that we have to work out, right? It's something that we have
Mm-hmm.
to sharpen to be able to recognize where those things are. And most of that's historical materialism. Yes.
You have to have ideology. If you do not have an ideological grounding, it doesn't. You can read a million things, and it's not going to matter.
Yep. I think that's absolutely true. Like, because my family, they finally decided that my rantings are actually useful now. So now that they are afraid, now they're like, maybe she's been saying something that we should have been listening to the past few years. So now I get that a lot from a couple of them. Like, oh my God, this is so kind. I'll send them an article. I'll send them an article from BAR. I'll send them an article, a press release from BAP or whatever, something from the AAPRP or what. It just like, look, it's a page. Read it. Come on. Oh, this seems so complex. This isn't what they said on the news. How do I know which one is telling the truth and which one is lying? And then we have to talk about imperialism, because that's how you know who's lying. That literally is how you know.
And it also matters to follow changes in trends, right? So in relationship to the Venezuelan elections, right? Jimmy Carter's election. Well, yeah, not him, but the election. The election observation machine has long been observing.
That's true. He has been.
Right? And early on, even the Jimmy Carter situation was saying elections in Venezuela are free and fair, are acceptable, all of these things, right? But there's been a change in leadership there. And so it has become, over the past decade or more, increasingly right-wing. And so even in the past, like maybe 20 years ago, where the Jimmy Carter Institute, for example, was a little bit more progressive, a little bit more, whatever.
On the right side.
On the right side. I mean, obviously it has its own issues, but I think even when we have organs like news organs or these entities, these what are they called? Organizations that might have a long-standing record of being something that can be trustworthy. We still have to be able to continue to watch as things change and show us that, perhaps this organization, this organ, this news media outlet is not where to stay because something has shifted there. And we have to be able to detect those things as well.
Like Al Jazeera.
Exactly.
I mean, but it do be catching you off guard though, when your trusted sources all of a sudden, and on every other issue of imperialism, they could be dead spot on right. But dear God, talk about it. Bring up Syria and watch them lose their mind about Assad. Bring up Ukraine and watch them lose their mind about Putin, and confuse the whole anti-imperialist agenda, because now you've got people who you thought understood anti-imperialism now believing, but this thing that the state is doing to the Syrians, that's okay because Assad was evil. It's okay that they're having a proxy war in Ukraine against Russia because Putin is the fucking devil. So that's okay. So, I mean, it really does. It's been kind of like this weird whiplash thing watching some of these left outlets put out and individuals that I also cannot mention because I'm trying not to get sued. Put out statements about these global issues that are imperialist. And they're siding with imperialism, confusing the fuck out of people, and making our job that much harder. Because now we got to unconfuse people that we just got to understand what imperialism is.
All right. So speaking of Syria, Jackie.
Lord have mercy. This whole situation. I was like, come on, could y'all have waited to have cooed this man until like June, July, gave us some time to just, relax but no, y'all got to carry out a genocide in Gaza, oppression in Congo, attempted coups and interfering in the AES. And now you've invaded, invaded and partitioned Syria. this, I think when I heard it, I was shocked, but then I kind of had to sit back and be like, well, why were you shocked though? Because you knew they were after these people. Wesley Clark told everybody that the US government was after Syria and 6 other countries to coup them in 5 years back in 2003. The former General Wesley Clark just flat out told folks, these people have taken over. And he literally said it like, he framed it as the US government was couped by neocons that came in the 90s and turned what he claimed Bush's more responsible US involvement around the world, which, okay, that's bullshit right there. But that's what Bush, the first Bush, was peddling. And that the American people did not want this proactive, militaristic, violent, cooing, overthrowing people. That's not what the American people wanted, because that's not what Bush said that he was going to bring. But that's what these neocons did. And this was a plan to coup these 7 countries: Iraq, Iran, Syria, Sudan. What was the 2 others? Venezuela. And it wasn't Cuba. I think it was. Yes, thank you. Lebanon. 7. I think there's another one I can't remember. Maybe Russia. Maybe it was Russia. I'm not sure. But 7 countries in 5 years. Wesley Clark announced that in 2003, but that plan was told to him. Thank you, Libya. Thank you.
Shout out.
That plan was told to him in the 90s. So the United States government has been plotting to do what they finally were able to do for 30 years in Syria. So to me, Syria's fall to imperialism is, and this is an excellent article, by the way, that is in Black Agenda Report, and I will drop it in the chat, because it does talk about some of the internal contradictions that were going on in Syrian society. And, how Assad he wasn't God. He wasn't perfect. He wasn't Jesus. He was not perfect. But here is the thing that has been driving me nuts about this issue. That, again, even when we raise this issue with folks on the left, what's the first thing people say when you talk about, damn, the US finally got Syria? The first thing people say is, well, Assad gassed his own people. And These are leftists. These are so-called folks on the so-called left.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to say to that, like I literally had this conversation with somebody who's very, very dear to me last night. And I'm not sure where it is. I'm not sure if they're ever going to talk to me again. And you know what? I'm okay with that. It's going to be a little painful if that's the case. But look, it is what it is. I don't give a shit what Bashar al-Assad did. I don't give a damn. I don't care what he did, because he was not couped because of anything he did to the Syrian people. He wasn't couped because of anything he did at all. If he was actually the evil, brutal dictator that US and Western imperialism claimed he was, doing all of that lying about him gassing his own people, then he'd still be in power. Because we know how this government loves dictators. This government will prop up a fascist dictator in a second. I mean, look at who they put in power in Syria. So this is another example of the kind of serious problem we have with whatever the left is in this country. The left is weak in this country, not because of Black leftists, not because of queer folks, not because of trans folks. No, the left is weak because the left has an identity crisis in regard to its own ideology when it comes to imperialism, of all things. That should be the foundation of what the left is. You ought to be anti-imperialist all the time in every instance, because when is there ever good imperialism? But we have seen again with Syria that we are having the same kinds of circular, endless discussions about individual actors like Assad, instead of the primary contradiction in this situation, which is the people who cooed Assad and why they did it. And more importantly, what's going to happen now, not just to Syrians, but also Palestinians, to Lebanese, and to Africans. This is an issue that touches so many groups of people. The partitioning of Syria is happening right now.
Mhm.
The massacres are happening right now, because folks do know, and I'm not sure if people really do understand, but the people who internally led this with the support of the US and Israel and Turkey are actually ISIS and Al-Qaeda affiliated terrorists. That the US government, the State Department, had a $10 million bounty on the leader of this group, HTS. $10 million, the US, because he is a terrorist. And they put that man, I think who is he? He is now the head of intelligence or something or other in Syria. The US has removed the bounty. The State Department removed the $10 million bounty from his head, because now he's been reformed as a rebel, and he's been dressed up. He's been given an imperialist costume like Zelensky was, right? All of those olive green sweatshirts, sweatsuits that Zelensky, that was the what do you call it? The marketing. That was the imperialist marketing of Zelensky, the fascist. They had to make him look like this military might and this brave person fighting this huge enemy. And that little 4-foot something coke addict, former comedian, is just wearing the same damn sweatsuits that the US shipped him. Because at this point, after he said what he said, they're like, well, we can't help you no more. So he gonna have to wear them sweatsuits for the rest of his life. So the same reforming of someone who was like a comedian. Zelensky was literally a comedian before this. The empire has now taken a whole terrorist and gave them the Zelensky treatment, dressed him up in an acceptable, media-friendly outfit, trimmed his beard, made him, cleaned that joint up, made his beard all shiny. And now he looked kind of hot. And y'all aren't supposed to know he's a goddamn terrorist. And by terrorist, I mean it in every sense of the word. But again, we're not having the conversation about any of that when we're talking about Syria with folks on the left. We're still talking about the guy who was deposed. These people are still talking about how evil Assad was. And when they do that, they're basically saying, well, maybe it was okay that he was cooed this time by the empire.
So why? Right. Oh, shit. Sorry. Right. So, I think we need to ask questions like, why is it that I do not live in Syria. I am not Syrian. What I do know is that Israel did not bomb every single military base and the airport and destroy any military capability that Syria had when Assad was in power. Why is it that happened? Right? Musa dropped this in the chat, which is true. Why is it that happened the minute the rebels were in power? And so I think, and they're all part of what we talked about. I'm in this anti-imperialist group, and it's sort of like the narrative is, there's so much of this narrative about believe Syrians. Which Syrians?
Right.
Just imagine, again, in the US context, if we're like, believe Americans, which Americans? Because there's millions who voted for Trump, right? Mm-hmm. Then there's millions that voted for Harris, which is their own
better.
bag of dog shit. But so I think, and we are anti-imperialist, and we understand U.S. imperialism to be the primary contradiction. And what we do know is that when the U.S. backs and props up a leader, it is never in the interest of the Syrian people or any people.
Any people.
So if it is that, so there's not, so whatever people can say that Assad was doing this or that. What we do know is that whoever the U.S. puts in power is certainly not going to be in the interest or toward the liberation of the people, up to and including dismantling the Syrian state. And so this is what we need to, I think we need to keep in mind in the belly of the beast, is that we, that is identity politics. That is identity reductionism, to say like, we can't say shit. We have to believe whatever individual Syrian we know says. No, we don't, because we know U.S. imperialism. We know Western domination, right? We know militarism. We know these tactics. And so that needs to be the focal point of our analysis. So we'll see what unfolds and what the sort of people who are people are celebrating in the streets in Syria. Syria has been liberated. Okay. We'll see what that's looking like in 3 and 6 months.
And I don't think we have to wait that long, because they're killing people right now. Christians are leaving Syria. Christians and other religious minorities are leaving because people who are replacing Assad are fundamentalist Islamists. They are Wahhabists. They're the crazy ones. So I don't even think we're going to have to wait for 6 months to see what horror will befall the Syrian people. And in this article by let me see, the author's name is Issam El-Orgli. Sorry, I apologize. I tried really hard. And this person is Syrian. So they do talk about some of the problems that, people had with the Syrian government not gassing his own people. That wasn't one of the problems. And they do talk about Syrian society and some of the progressive aspects of Syrian society, like protection for all groups of people, regardless of a religious or other group or ethnicity. So that this means something horrible for the Kurds too, because Turkey hates the Kurds, hates them. So yeah.
Well, speaking of people getting killed right now, and then also being in the belly of the beast, next up on our list is Palestine. And I think, there's so much obviously to be said about what has unfolded in Palestine over the last year. I mean, I think when I last checked, the death toll is somewhere over 46,000 at the moment. I mean, obviously, just in this last week, we watched Israeli forces parade a group of patients out of the fucking hospital that they were going to bomb.
They set to fire the last functioning hospital in northern Gaza is no more. There are no functioning hospitals in northern Gaza anymore.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, I think that there's plenty to say, I think, about what the nature of the ongoing genocide is. But I think in terms of our conversation about imperialism and U.S. role in it, I want to focus how we think about this year in Palestine in Review on the types of repression that folks have experienced in the U.S. and what that means for, I think, a kind of public opinion about what's happening in Palestine and how people are perceiving what's happening in Palestine. So obviously, this year we watched Mamadou Tall, as a student at Cornell University, face potential deportation, which was eventually walked back, but he is actually still dealing with some of the fallout from that in terms of essentially like being on a pass system, not being able to move around the campus. I don't know if y'all remember that the same episode where we had Mamadou on, we had another young man named Prahlad Iyengar on, who is a student at MIT. They had a publication at MIT, I think it was like Written Revolution was the publication at MIT. And there was a piece that he wrote, which was basically arguing against pacifism. He was just saying like, what is pacifism doing for us, and what does it actually mean to have it as a stance as we are watching people literally, like as the last standing working hospital in Gaza was bombed, right? And so as a result of that, Prahlad was banned from campus, but I read an article just today that said he's facing expulsion for the next year. There was a professor, Michel de Graaf, who was also a professor at MIT, who was, I don't even know what the nature of this was, but he's a professor of linguistics, but his position was essentially demoted to like faculty at large because he had largely been supporting student demonstrations on MIT's campus, and particularly he had been supporting the publication of that particular written revolution publication that the students were developing. And so for him, I think he had proposed a class about genocide that was rejected. And then I think his pay was disrupted or whatever because of the public positions that he's taken on Palestine. And then in a like sort of, I mean, there are other faculty members who have at different stages of their careers lost their jobs or had offers rescinded. But this year we actually saw a tenured professor who long had done work on Palestine be fired because of her work on Palestine. That was Mara Finkelstein at Muhlenberg College, which is in Pennsylvania. And I believe the story there was that, initially she was told that her students were complaining about how she was teaching and talking about Palestine. And she was basically called into the office and asked by the provost, like, was she teaching it from both sides? And she's like, what does that even mean? It was later discovered that it was only one student who had actually filed a complaint, and that student actually declined to push for an investigation against the professor. But it was the university itself who had decided that they would then go back into the work that this particular professor was tenured based on to say, how have you been writing and talking about Palestine? And they used that as a decision to fire her. And I just want to read one quote from Mara Finkelstein. She was a professor of cultural anthropology. And I think it's interesting in this conversation about sort of belief, like, what we're questioning who we believe and how we believe them. But I also think, like, as an anthropologist, somebody who utilizes ethnography and the experiences of Palestinians, one of the things that she said was very important to her over the years is that every time she teaches about Palestine, it's very important to her to like have Palestinian authors, like the works of Palestinians who are talking about the genocide, because often when people ask the question, are you talking about or teaching about the issue of Palestine from both sides? What they're really saying is, are you giving the pro-Israeli perspective?
Right.
And if you have any kind of position that is at all sympathetic to the plight of Palestinian people, then you are anti-Semitic, you are, all these other things. So one of the things that she said in one of the articles published about her experience is, when I teach, I rely on the scholarship of Palestinian anthropologists and anthropologists of Palestine to provide me and my students with a framework through which to understand the region. We should all be doing this no matter what our region or subfield training. Palestine is relevant. If we teach about infrastructure, we should be talking about checkpoints in the West Bank. If we are in environmental studies, we can be teaching about Gaza's lack of access to decent drinking water. If we are in disability studies, medical anthropology, or global health, we should be teaching about the overwhelming number of Palestinian amputees targeted by Israeli snipers during the March of Return in Gaza or routinely in the West Bank. If we teach about childhood and education, we should be teaching about scholasticide in Gaza. If we teach about the global weapons trade or policing, we should be teaching about U.S. arms sales and military funding to Israel. Especially with the advent of multi-sided ethnography, there's no topic we can teach that doesn't link to Palestine. And I think that this is true as it relates to Palestine, but I think this is also kind of the broader conversation that we're having about taking these ongoing examples of what's happening in terms of like mass collective struggle and helping us to understand all of these different aspects of life, right? And so the same way that she, kind of laid out, there are elements of what's happening in Palestine that are important to us if we think that we are concerned with the environment, if we think that we are concerned with education, if we think that we are concerned with health. And so I think that what I take from that is that no matter what it is that we think is our reason for being in the world, there is a way to engage in these ongoing struggles for dignity, liberation, freedom, right? To be able to live, you know, as whole human beings, no matter what it is that we're interested in. And that it is up to us to be able to find what those connections are and to make whatever work we do be of use to people in the world. And I think that that is one of the big lessons that I continue to learn. And I think that we are learning as we're watching what's unfolding in Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can't help but think, like, we've seen all of this throughout the whole year on social media all over the place. Like, whatever it is you're doing now, that's what you would have been doing in Nazi Germany. Like, whatever you're doing now, that's what you would have been doing, you know, at whatever point. If you claimed, oh, I would have done something different, you know, when the settlers came, whatever. No, you wouldn't. No, you wouldn't. You would have, well, most of us wouldn't have been able to be one of the settlers anyway, because that Homestead Act was not, you know, they didn't offer us that kind of land. But what really has struck me is that even as we are seeing the empire target a group of people that they had previously kind of left alone, right? That we haven't seen, like, we have not seen academics, tenured professors, you know, be fired and dragged out of their classrooms and that kind of thing. We haven't seen a whole lot of that. We haven't seen a whole lot of journalists being fired for telling the truth. We have not seen a whole lot. Not saying it hasn't happened, but generally it doesn't happen so often that is something that we would just look at and go, okay, that's just Tuesday. It just doesn't happen that much. But when it does, in this context, people who have decided this genocide doesn't matter to them have also decided that people who are being punished because they do care about humanity, their oppression doesn't matter to them either. And it's like this weird, in my mind, it's like this weird sliding scale of apathy, where it's like, okay, I get that you don't care about this thing that's going on 5,000 miles away. All right. Okay. You don't know anything about those people in that country. We can sit down and talk about it. Cool. But you don't have a problem with students being beaten up by the cops because they are protesting on their campus where they think they have a right to do this, and all they're doing is allegedly exercising their rights. You're cool with that? And people are like, well, yeah, because, you know, they're at school to learn. Their parents pay for that tuition. They're not paying for these are things that people have actually said to me when you know, I've asked them, hey, have you been to any of the encampments? The students would love to. They would just love for people to come out because they're kind of scared, and they're, you know, but they really feel like they have to do this. And people were really just like, well, if they would take their asses to class, they wouldn't be scared. You know what I mean? So it's like, it's this bizarre situation where, even as much as I think I understand about imperialism, I think the fact that human nature still scares the fuck out of me. Because, yeah, imperialism, I expect imperialists to do any and everything. What I haven't expected, and maybe I should have, maybe this is me and, you know, my soft, mushy heart, but me watching people not give a fuck about genocide, about repression, about the silencing of speech of your own kids on their college campuses being silenced. Like, why is that okay? Is that really the kind of country, the kind of life that you want your kid to grow up in, if they can get a big enough check? That has been wild for me. Like, man, what are we gonna do with all these people when the revolution comes?
You know, I just think that speaks to the effectiveness of Islamophobia and Orientalism and anti-Arab propaganda in this country since at least September 11th, but obviously far prior to that, since the enslaved insurrections that were largely led by by Muslim enslaved Africans. But anyway, but especially since 2001, like it has shown the complete dehumanization and that people have internalized, as well as, you know, a whole bunch of neoliberal individualist, xenophobic logics, and you know, to the point that people are willing to give up their own rights in order to maintain, you know, in order to not to abdicate responsibility to other human beings. So yeah.
Well, we got our last three.
Ooh.
Down to the last three, y'all. Thanks for sticking with it. This was supposed to be 2 hours, but since this is the last show, that's a
We
bit
don't
of
care.
food. Right. And, you know, now we get into the nitty gritty now. So we
Getting to the heavy hitters now. So obviously a big focus of much of our organizing in the past hour, Black Alliance for Peace. I am a member of the Black Alliance for Peace. Obviously, a great deal of our organizing in this past year has been focused on Haiti. Because once again, that's hard to read. Sorry about that. But once again, Haiti is under imperialist attack. Haiti is always under imperialist attack. Haiti is never not under imperialist attack. But the other thing we don't know, and I love this conversation, how we have brought up every instance of why we don't know these things. I love being able to be in a space where we're all like, yes, we are all so deeply indoctrinated, but you're deeply indoctrinated because you're just not looking at the right sources. Because we're out here telling you this stuff. We don't know that Haitian people have been in the streets damn near every day for years. Years. I mean, going back to 2013. You did protesting against the fucking Clinton Foundation when they suppressed the wages of the garment factories, the garment manufacturers. Because why were the people protesting? Because the garment manufacturers that have a lot of their headquarters in Haiti, because they use the Haitian people for cheap labor to make their Hanes and their, what's the other one? Old Navy. What's another one?
Victoria's Secret.
Thank you. Your Victoria's Secret. Just let me not say that. I can't tell me and Abdus's joke about Victoria's Secret.
Oh
no. And why Jacqueline Luqman could never shop in Victoria's Secret. But these companies, these landmark American or Canadian garment companies have a bunch of factories in Haiti. Because they're using the Haitian population for cheap labor. And by cheap, I mean a couple dollars a day. So the Haitian people were like, we can't live on this. And this was the same time that the core group fucked around and what's his name? Was it Macky Sall, I think, who and Hillary Clinton, who did away with the Petro-Caribe program, stole the money from Petro-Caribe. That was a program that Chavez started from Venezuela to be in solidarity with the Haitian people. Y'all need to stop saying we don't have friends. I respect Baba Dr. Clark a lot too. But he was not entirely right when he said that Africans have no friends. That is not entirely true. So this Haitian thing, we understand that it has never ended. It is never intended to end. There is never a period where Haiti is not under attack. Because of their unique role in the history of liberation struggles for African people, of course, we are always looking at Haiti. But everybody around the world looks at Haiti. This is the other thing we don't know. Other people around the world fighting against imperialism also look to Haiti as their North Star. So here we are, not knowing a lot about Haiti, because again, that's those people over there. And anyway, since so many of us have been raised in this ridiculous white Christian nationalist tradition, we think they all go into hell, they all worship the devil because they practice voodoo.
Right.
That's a whole nother conversation that I do not have enough alcohol to get into that conversation.
What is speaking in tongues and catching the spirit if not possession?
Girl, don't even. And then you're going to speak in tongues and jump up and dance at the same fucking time every goddamn service. That's not the Holy Spirit. Anyway, let me get back to the...
What is busting a man windows out and slashing his tie? I'm just playing. Just kidding. I don't know what you think about that.
Don't get me started on all the church drama that comes out from these people. And it's like, you are lecturing somebody on morality?
Listen.
Woo. So once again, the United States trying to fully invade Haiti. Haiti is already occupied by the core group. Nobody elected the members of the core group in Haiti. They didn't elect those people to run them. The core group decides who the prime minister and his cabinet will be. The Haitians didn't vote for any of those people either. They want everybody gone. Mm-hmm. We have been fighting to raise this issue in this country, and we will continue to fight. But this year, once again, in the midst of everything else this government was doing, they decided, okay, well, let's try to invade Haiti again. Mm-hmm. And this time, who stepped up to volunteer to lead it? Kenyans.
Kenya goofy ass. I love my Kenyan comrades, but that was goofy. And this is how, on the one hand, Kenya can send their little 100 troops to Haiti, but then also have economic conditions whereby they are having to send people to go work in places like Lebanon and Southwest Asia,
mm-hmm.
and
or Ukraine.
Once Israel bombs, and people want to talk about anti-blackness. So shout out to Salifu for bringing this up when we had him on. So it's like you cannot rescue your people after having to be sent out to work as domestic servants elsewhere, but you can send these 100 soldiers to Haiti. Okay.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because remember with Ukraine, when it first popped off and the people were leaving Ukraine and they were in the train station, and the soldiers, the Ukrainian soldiers, who are a bunch of Nazis, they will tell you they are Nazis. I am not speaking ill of these people. They pulled all of the Africans, because they're African immigrants in Ukraine, off the train, pulled them off the train, forced them off that train so that the white folks could get in and leave. And then folks over here were like, that was the only thing black folks over here were concerned about. Like, oh my God, they're so racist.
But Ben wanted to condemn them for being there to study, didn't want to give them any kind of citizenship, anything to fully exist as human beings. And then you want to ask them to come and fight on their damn side. Like, why would you do that?
Right. But then we need to ask the question, if people are like, oh my God, they're racist, anti-blackness. But then you need to be asking yourself, why are our African cousins having to go to Ukraine to go to school?
Yes.
Why are they having to go to Ukraine to get a job? Why the devil do they need to go to a country that has a well-known and very, very widely established fascist base? Why? Because of the instability that imperialism and neocolonialism still creates in their countries. This is why we are so hyper-focused on keeping our organizing laser-focused on Haiti, on the zone of peace, on the global South. Because this is where the liberation of all people is coming from, because this is where liberation began. And everybody else around the world seems to get that. And we still having to argue the primacy, the importance of Haiti and all liberation struggles. So BAP will continue to focus on Haiti. We'll have more demonstrations. We just did, and we'll get to this in a minute, we just did a demonstration last year, big demonstration, when this was announced at the Kenyan embassy, where we got out there with our bullhorns and talked shit about them people for a couple of hours. They were peeking out the windows of that embassy like, oh my God, what are the Americans doing on? Oh my God, do we call the police on them?
Oh my God.
Oh no. The short one. Yes, see, do you see her? The short one. Get her. Get the megaphone away from that one. No. And the tall one too. No, take the megaphone away from her too. Oh no. Is that Rafiki Morris? Oh no.
Oh my gosh. Speaking of taking the megaphone away, our number
That was
2
a great
story, right, is of course about African Stream. We talked about this on LSR. We talked about it all over this platform. All this matters to all the African radical organizations, all freedom of information loving peoples all over the world. So on September 13th this year, raggedy ass U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken called African Stream a secretly run Russian state TV network linked to RT, called them Kremlin propagandists. And so African Stream was unceremoniously dismissed from YouTube, Meta, which includes Facebook, Instagram, and Threads. They were dismissed from Stripe, TikTok, and Google. Google was particularly pernicious because they lost all of their data. I just saw in the chat that they're back on YouTube, which is great, but the effects, that does not undermine the effects that this repression had. So in response to this, to African Stream being deplatformed, there was a coalition that was formed. The Coalition to Defend African Stream was launched on November 4th, 2024. And so essentially what they say is that this deplatforming undermined the human rights of 8 billion people who have the human right of access to information. And, you know, we were talking earlier about how do we discern, like, how do we know what information to believe? Well, African Stream was a platform that we can believe that, and they largely were targeted because of their the veracity with which they reported about the AES, because they were on the ground talking to ordinary people who were excited and happy about the ouster of France and the United States and the self-determination of the AES, among other reasons, right? And so basically what this coalition is demanding is that the U.S. State Department retracts that stupid September 17th statement. Stanford subsequently came out with a report that was equally egregious, that basically talked about why it is that African Stream was a Russian front. What are the patterns that they followed that gave credence to this argument? Meaning that Stanford retract that statement, that all of the mainstream and small media outlets retract any articles of misinformation about African Stream, and that they be reinstated on YouTube, Meta, TikTok, and Google. And so the struggle continues. And this is important because if they can, you know, if they can take away African Stream, they can take away Black Agenda Report, they can take away Hood Communist, they can take away Black Liberation Media and any other platform that deigns to tell the truth about African people, about radicalism, about socialism, Pan-Africanism, what have you. And so this was and remains a big deal. It's not unrelated to the Uhuru 3 case. I wrote a piece in Grassroots Thinking, connecting these two. Other people have made these connections, obviously. And the continued attack on radical Black thinking and knowledge production and truth telling. And this is something that is only going to get worse as the fascist forces, again, feel free reign under this new administration, as they, you know, continue to attack every institution. Everything is up for grabs. Everything is under attack. And of course, being the least organized and the most oppressed and repressed, we are grist for that mill. So we need to continue. We can't sit by idly as our platforms that matter to us are under attack and are removed. And we, you know, so that we're only left with mouthpieces of the state. Grist for the mill.
That's
They just be pulling them out.
But you know, this has a precedence too, and not going all the way back to Red Scare, because you know how people don't like to read. We keep telling people to read, and we know they ain't gonna do it. So I don't know how we gonna fix that. I think we just we need to make TikTok videos. Apparently, that's what we need to do.
Ain't TikTok going away in January?
I don't know. Is that the deadline now? Okay,
January 17th or something.
Okay, so we need to make Instagram videos. I guess if we still gonna have.
I also think one thing that we started doing on LSR, which people said they wanted more of, is literally just reading on the show, like having segments where we're reading aloud, and that's
like okay. So, I'm like, all right, y'all gonna watch me read a book, okay? and pull out Stephen King's The Stand. Here we go.
No. Trump said he's keeping the tiki-talkie. It was his idea to get rid of the shit. I don't believe that, man, and I don't care because I don't even got no TikTok. So.
Oh, please, no. But you know what? There's precedent.
Black Planet. Post Black Planet.
Please don't bring Black Planet. Don't. Let's not bring bring back Black Planet and make it Black Political Planet, because it was a fucking mess when it was just Black. No, thank you. No, but you know what? When this happened to RT and Sputnik in 2022, right after, a couple of months after the Russian special military operation in Ukraine, again with the leftists, with the like, oh well, you shouldn't be working for the Russians. It's like, first of all, we're journalists, and there is no U.S. corporate outlet that would hire us because we are anti-imperialist, because we are not going to sit there and write puff pieces, and we sure as hell aren't going to both sides imperialism. And no, so we have an outlet, we have an opportunity to say whatever we want, and it just happens to be working for the Russians. Okay. They're not telling me what to say. I'm fine. And for the most of the time we were there, they didn't. But the response that people had to that, to the deplatforming of RT and Sputnik and Press TV from Iran. And people were just like, well, we don't know what those foreign outlets are telling people. You don't know what the fuck CNN is telling you.
Correct.
You don't know what these people on Channel 4 News at 5 o'clock are telling you. You don't know they are lying to you. China, Xi Jinping is not lying to you about what this country is doing. Now, he might be lying about some shit that's going on in China. I don't know. I don't live in China. But I can tell you that nobody from a foreign country is, let me stop, with the exception of Israel.
Look, that's right.
Israel is the one foreign country on this planet that literally does not have to abide by the foreign agent registry laws in the United States. Israel is the only country that does not have to register as a foreign agent. Yep. So when this happened to RT and Sputnik, that should have been the moment where people were like, oh, violation of First Amendment rights. This is wrong. We need to, but people were like, no, that's the Russians and the Chinese, and CNN said they were our enemy. So I can't help those stupid Negroes working for them. And now that it's happened to Africans, now you upset? Okay, thanks for playing. Thank you.
All right. So y'all, we are ending. We want to end on a high note, and our number one story of 2024 is, of course, the AES.
Woohoo!
Yes. Again, we had Tunde who attended I can't remember the exact name of the conference. I don't know if you do, but it was the conference in support of, I can't remember. Somebody will drop it in the chat. But he talked about this convening that happened. Tunde attended, and there were people from across the continent, as well as from the United States, and other, I think, Cuba and other places within around the world that attended.
More than 20 countries represented.
Yeah, more than 20 countries represented. And so I would say I am cautiously optimistic and excited for what is happening in the AES, cautiously, because we know that any assertion of self-determination comes under attack, and has already been under attack by, for example, funding terrorist groups in Mali, for example, Ukraine funding these groups and backing these groups, it means U.S. because Ukraine is, U.S. lapdog. So the attacks are already happening, but the AES is standing tall, standing strong, and doing things like uniting their communications infrastructure, uniting their passports, and creating conditions for an even broader unified Africa.
One of the things that I have found really inspiring about watching the AES situation unfold is also the particular way that I think in all their cases, but in the case of Burkina Faso, Traore has really taken so many pages from Sankara's playbook. And when I say that, I don't just mean it in terms of celebrating Sankara as an individual, but that there has been so much talk, particularly among Black folks, about the failed project of Pan-Africanism, the failed project of African liberation, of African independence. And so much of what we've seen is that Traore is not trying to reinvent the wheel in many ways. He is really saying, like, there were initiatives that were being put into place. He has returned to this getting away from fast fashions. He's got the Burkinabe people back in local garments, pushing back to cutting back state representative. Pushing back cutting back salaries of state representatives. I mean, there's so many things that were a part of Sankara's way of governing the country.
She said, huh?
What I do?
that Sankara attempted to govern the country. That Traore said, we don't got to do new stuff. Like, we can go back to doing this, and there's a reason.
He said, "I baby, we open it up the conversation."
That's hilarious. That's hilarious.
He said, "Bruh, it is 7:30. What did you do?" Are you kidding me?
It's like, dinner time was at 6, right?
We were there for a minute, like, come on, girl. But I say that to say that so much of what I see in the AES is not a rejection of the political history of Africa. It's not saying that we fucked up, we didn't do things right. It's actually saying that we got a lot of shit right.
Yeah.
And that so much of what went wrong was all of these external forces trying to break that shit down, and being able to return. And again, it's not just like, copying things verbatim, but to say that, like, we got a lot of things right, and that we can trust our own analysis on some things. We can look to our history, our leaders, for examples of what we should do and how we should exist, and that we don't, like, even as much as it's important to be able to, be versed in the Marxist tradition, to understand Mao, to understand all of these different iterations of communist, socialist political agendas that have been put into play. I think it is very important that the AES shows us that we have our own homegrown solutions to our problems, and that we can guide ourselves. And that is what I find to be really invigorating about what's happening with the Alliance for Sahel States, and how I think it's spreading too, because who would have thought that Senegal,
Right?
Yeah.
all countries, we're gonna disrupt the CFA franc, and that's really gonna fucking fuck with the French, right? So I think so many things to celebrate there.
But at the same time, we need to be mindful of the ways that France and the US are trying to shore up relationships with Chad, with Cote d'Ivoire, with all these Togo, with all these surrounding countries. And so, being mindful of that, and also, like, not engaging in an uncritical celebration, but really taking the AES seriously as a burgeoning region, as a new iteration or a sort of resurgent iteration of African self-determination, and study, right? How, just like we would study anywhere else, right? Really taking seriously and staying mindful and attentive about what's happening there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So okay, I'm just gonna say the inappropriate thing because I'm
like, don't.
Huh?
I'm like, don't get him.
Okay, yeah, because I understand he's 36, but Troy, he fine. He is fine. He is fine. And that man, he better stop. He better stop with all that good socialist shit he doing. Stop it.
Look at
Like,
this.
you just, oh. But aside from that, cougar auntie observation, I love that you said that we shouldn't be engaged in an uncritical celebration, because the first thing I feel like we should have thought about, and I think a lot of us did, which is why you didn't see a whole lot of folks just out, jubilant, all kinds of, is because we recognize that the formation and the formalization of the AES marks a critical point in this new fight against neocolonialism, or not new, renewed fight against neocolonialism and imperialism that makes it more dangerous for them, right? Like, so the repression that we just hit on a little bit, when we heard about this happening, and when it started happening with, folks just telling France, the military, to get the heck out, we knew then, it's like, oh man, they're making enemies. They're making enemies of these people. Yeah. So, we'll continue to watch, but we should continue to expect the kind of propaganda, misinformation, the lies about them and what they're doing in their countries to come out. But we should also continue to remain optimistically protective of the work that they are doing in the AES. This is amazing, I think, for me. And it's really just a beautiful thing.
It really is. Sankara pounded on that.
That's right. Pound it, baby. That's right.
Look, we taught her today. We taught her to go. So that's what she was trying to do to me when she was trying to make my lips.
She's been doing that, but it's replaced the pound is now the
pounding.
Anyway, thank y'all so much for sticking with us for an hour and a half, 2 hours and a half.
Yes.
That's the length of that wiki movie.
That's also old LDI shows.
Yeah. So
wait.
That
she's pounding the audience, y'all.
Yeah. There, get my big pound. We're hanging.
She was gonna hold it till somebody.
She was like, "No, this is enough." Okay.
So thank you again so much. I hope you all have a wonderful new year, and that found our discussion informative, helpful, etc. But
keep watching, and not just us, but keep watching what's happening in the world to maintain that critical lens.
Yeah. All right, y'all.
Peace.
Oh my gosh. Oh my, every